But lots to talk about. We can come maybe some questions at the end of the sessions. And already we're getting some really good questions in, by the way, from the audience. And I'd love to get more, so please keep them coming. Next up, right, we've got Emma Schuster, who Emma is a climate risk analyst at non-profit shareholder activism organization Just Share, which advocates for corporate South Africa to use its financial and social power to drive urgent action to combat climate change and reduce inequality. Emma is an expert too on corporate governance, responsible investment, and the broader piece of shareholder activism. So welcome, Emma, to our webinar. And I guess I would really like to hear from you and ask you around the legal implications of greenwashing. How can we identify greenwashing, and what does it mean for corporate reporting more broadly?
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's wonderful to be part of this conversation. Yes, as from my intro, you can tell that I'm coming from the position of an activist, which means that, well, I thought I was going to say that it means that my views are sometimes maybe a bit more urgent, or some might say idealistic, although what I'm hearing from others, it doesn't actually seem that way. And it's really nice to think of accountants playing an activist role in this process, in identifying and calling out greenwashing. In any case, in a time of crisis, being a bit idealistic is not a bad thing. So about the legal stuff, it's not straightforward to talk about the legal consequences of greenwashing generally. At the moment, it's something that's still kind of being thrashed out in various ways through the courts, in parliaments, the regulators. But one of the definitions which comes up a lot, which we see often, is describes greenwashing as a marketing tactic, right? Which implies that the target is consumers or users of a particular product. But it's important to make a small distinction, especially in the way that the litigation plays out, between that kind of marketing-related greenwashing and then greenwashing that's intended to mislead investors and shareholders. So the marketing-related greenwashing, this is when companies brand a particular product or their company, but through adverts as being green in some way. And there are plenty of examples of legal actions that have been taken and are just exponentially coming to courts, either through courts or through advertising authorities or consumer protection authorities. And a lot of these have led to some significant outcomes. So bans on fossil fuel adverts in public areas, orders to withdraw certain ads, and even quite significant fines. The Italian Competition Authority fined a fossil fuel company 5 million euros recently for an advert that said that labeled diesel as green and calling it good for the environment. And it's not just fossil fuel companies. I mean, it covers everything from the cases from bin liners to airlines, oat milk, and then even major financial institutions. So I'm sure some people would have heard of the complaint against HSBC recently, where regarding its advert about protecting the Great Barrier Reef. And this one was really interesting to me because it's not really a direct misrepresentation. It's not about a green fund or a green project, but it's looking at the company as a whole and saying, well, you can't do both. You can't finance hugely environmentally destructive projects or companies or industries and then also advertise talking about protecting the environment. So those kind of claims are based on advertising or consumer protection laws. And then there's this other kind of greenwashing that is intended to mislead investors and shareholders or other stakeholders like the activists, which takes place kind of away from the wider consumer public. It's aimed at people that read company reports, public filings, and kind of company policies, that kind of thing. And this is where the claims are about having integrated ESG into business processes, kind of gone a bit crazy. In terms of, so there's the relationship between ESG integration and greenwashing. We like to kind of think of it as if ESG is the practice of integrating non-financial considerations into business practices, then greenwashing is the art of pretending to do that. And that's the kind of thing which is a little bit trickier sometimes to identify and can be quite sophisticated. So just for example, a major South African bank a year or two ago released a fossil fuel financing policy. And in it are all kinds of broad statements about commitment to the just transition, commitment to the Paris goals. But there are no real short or medium-term commitments, no strategies or targets that would give substance to those broad commitments, those broad claims. And it also talks about the importance of gas as a transition fuel and the role of gas in developing Africa, despite significant evidence now that gas is neither least cost nor quickest nor the best way to address energy insecurity on the continent. So they've got this policy, and then as a result, the time comes for the company to produce its annual report on its emissions profile. And we see that the bank has actually increased its financing of fossil fuels over that period, which is, as it reports, is in line with its fossil fuel policy. And factually that's true, but the policy in this case has done nothing but provide kind of a veneer or a pretense that the company is doing something about climate change while it just continues with its business as usual, which is direct financing of fossil fuels. And this kind of greenwashing is also facing legal consequences. Now, there are cases that are based on security fraud. That's the claim. And this is a potentially much heavier and more significant consequence that can bring in direct liability of individual directors, including jail terms. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but it's fully possible within these kinds of cases in other examples. And there are, so the direct liability for directors hasn't happened, but there are cases based on this kind of claim. So there's the case of DWS last year, which was quite a high-profile one in which the German law enforcement publicly raided the offices of Deutsche Bank and DWS purely on the basis that they had evidence that the company was not taking ESG factors into account, despite proclaiming that its products were green and sustainable. And then finally, just outside of the courts, there's also big movements within government regulators, particularly in financial conduct authorities that are starting to crack down on greenwashing. The UK and the US, both of their major securities exchange authorities have made really big pronouncements and strides in this area. In the UK, a new law will see penalties of up to 10% of global turnover for breaches of consumer law. That's a significant amount for a major multinational corporation. And even individuals who breach these laws can face fines up to £300,000. And then finally, in the EU, I think most people will know about the European Commission's last month published a proposal for a new directive, which is called the Green Claims Directive. And it's a pretty comprehensive proposal that aims to ensure kind of transparent communication and proper substantiation of environmental claims. I have to say that in the time between a kind of an announcement like this and implementation, there's a lot of lobbying that goes on. So what it ends up being may be different, but the tide is not going to change. You know, this is the direction that the law is taking. So yeah, just to end, I'll say that these conversations about like how to identify and avoid it are really important. But in truth, companies just need to be on board with the fundamental, on a deeper level, the reality of the issues. So with climate related claims, that means, you know, understanding the urgency, understanding the impacts, understanding what needs to be done, and then aligning strategies and plans with that, in which case greenwashing won't be necessary, and nor would it be to avoid it. But as Michael said in his introduction, this is obviously where accountants and other professionals play such an important role. So I will leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Emma, thank you so much. I mean, that's such a comprehensive overview of all the different regulatory pushes. And as you say, it's, to an extent only the beginning, isn't it? Right. So this is the direction of travel. It's going to get tighter, and companies are going to feel more and more under pressure from regulators to do it, even if they're not doing it themselves for whatever reason. And some great examples. I think many people will be familiar with the HSBC example, particularly here in the UK. A lot of the big oil companies are getting, lots of pressure as well from activists. And we're seeing shareholder activism as well, aren't we? Which is kind of interesting. This is starting to become a financial shareholder issue where people are, entering the shareholder base and using their stakes as means to drive change as well. And before we move on, there's one quick question which is coming from the floor, and I did want to ask you about it, just because I think it's perhaps the other side of the coin to some degree. And this is a question from one of our viewers. Is how can we prevent regulation and the fear of negative reputational risks resulting in greenwashing? And the greenwashing, I'm sure, is something you're familiar with, which is when companies are too scared almost to make claims. And it'd be good if you have a sort of a better definition than that. But that is what I would say. So what do you think about that? Do you think greenwashing is a real risk on the flip side of this?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a good term. I actually haven't heard that particular term before, but I think that, as I just sort of said earlier, the honest reporting is really all that's needed, and I can't imagine that the legislation in general, due to lobbying and whatever, is generally less prescriptive. So I don't know, I haven't seen examples of this happening, of corporates holding back on their green claims. I think put in the proper context in their reports, I think one of the things that happens, especially around sustainable finance reporting, is that companies will report on the number, so the dollar amount that they've invested into sustainable finance, which most people are not comfortable really with numbers, and so it looks like a lot. But put in context, it may mean, only a small percentage of the portfolio. I just think that, kind of as Yashi said, the more information, the more transparency, the better. People need to understand what the company is doing so that they can make informed decisions. I think an intention to frame anything in a particular way can get you in trouble, but as much information and put in its proper context, I can't see why that regulation should have that perverse effect.